Welcome back to class 8 of mdo204. In this class, we're going to cover the volumetrics that we're going to be putting in this scene. I think you're really going to enjoy the process of it and what Modo can do with it and how good it looks. So let's hop right in and get started. Okay, so before we start adding volumetrics to our scene, I just want to explain what they are and how to manipulate and use them a little bit. So we're going to come over to Add Item, and we're going to come down to Volumes, and we're going to choose Volume. Now there's other types of volume things in here, such as Blob, Sprite, but we're just going to choose Volume. And you can see that this adds the volume item to our items list here. And we can see the volume represented here in our scene by this guy here. So, with our volume selected, I can come down to the properties, and with my mouse over this properties bin here, I can hit the 0 on my number pad to make this full screen. I can hit 0 again to collapse that. Whatever your mouse is over, you can hit 0 to kind of bring it full screen. Much in the same way in Nuke, you can hit spacebar to make that area full screen as well. So with this full screen, we can look at our volume properties. We can look at volume particles, volume shading, and these are going to be the two main ones that we're going to be working in. And to see what's actually going on, I'm going to hop over to the render tab here, and we can kind of see that we have a volume in the background. I think it might be easier if for both of us if I just change our background environment, and instead of a 4-color gradient, I'm going to change this to physically based daylight. And that'll just help us kind of be able to visualize this a little bit better. Let me find an angle here. So what's happening with this volume? Well, basically it's generating a particle that is a round sphere, and right now it basically is treating the light and diffusing it as it comes through. And there's a whole bunch of parameters that we can change to this one object right here to make it look different, allowing us to push and pull this volume to something that we want to use in our scene. So if I select volume, first thing under the volume particles here, we have a little particle geometry drop down here, and like I said, it's a sphere, but we could change this to a cube if we wanted. We could also change this to a cylinder, or cumulus, which is a half dome. I'm going to change this back to sphere. And there's a few other things here that we might come back to. Radius is exactly what it sounds. We can change the radius of this actual volumetric particle right here. But I'm going to come down to volume shading. Okay, so under the density drop-down menu here, we can see that we have a whole bunch of parameters that we can change. One of them is the color gradient. So if I double click this, I can actually apply a color to our volume object here. And I can also middle mouse click and put another keyframe in there and change that to blue. So what this will do is this particle will actually change color across this gradient over time. But we'll come back to this. We have density, which by changing this basically packs in how much smoke or volume is in this within this object here. So obviously if this was dropped down, it would be a lot brighter. And if we really push this, it's going to become cloud-like, allowing all of the light to be dispersed and bounced around inside. But if I were to change this to, let's say, 150, we can see now that this is a very dense object and a lot of the light is not shining through. So I'm just going to set this back to 50. Might help us see it a little bit easier. Fall off is basically the edging here. So if I were to drag this way down, we're going to get a nice sharp edge. And if we were to drag this up, we can see that we have a nice soft fall off on this edge here. I'm going to put this back to 50. We also have level, which is an offset for the density level, but I'm going to leave this alone for now. And we can actually change the density of this particle over the age by setting parameters in here. But I'm not going to worry about that just yet. We have hypertexture, amplitude, and scale. We'll come back to these here in just a second, but we have to set something up to actually use these. And what that would be is a layer that will drive how this volume is being treated and breaking up and stuff like that. And we're going to do that with a simple noise layer. So I'm going to come down to textures, come down to noise. And I don't want this in my environment, so I'm just going to drag this back out and drop that right here. So with this object selected, I'm going to hit Control and G to group it. And I'm going to call this volume. And I'm going to twirl this down, and so we have this noise. And I'm going to set this noise, come down to volumetric effects, and set this to volumetric density. And immediately we can see what's starting to look like a puffy cloud. So through this, I can then adjust these sample parameters here to get a look and feel within this volume itself. So you can start to see what's happening as I adjust the bias and gain. I can get some pretty wispy elements here. And I could easily come back into my volume item here, come to volume shading, and start to adjust my hypertexture amplitude, which now changes how this reacts to this volumetric density. So if I turn that on, I can use these hypertextures to change this. The scale amount as well. That's a pretty wild and interesting result. I'm going to undo that. Drag this up. So we're getting a nice wispy element here. And we're going to grow in that texture, grow out that texture. And the cool thing about Modo is these are all channels that we can animate. So over time I could set a keyframe and have this either dissipate off or dissipate on. I could also drive it with the actual noise itself. We can see what happens if I start to adjust some of these sample parameters up here. So a lot of flexibility to make some pretty interesting shapes within this volumetric item here. Now that we know kind of how these work, let's set this up with dynamics and make this a animated feature that we can use in our scene. Okay, so here we are in class 8, and this is basically from class 7, and we're going to start working on this. One thing I want you to note, that within our model itself, there's an item that I have turned off, and that's going to be, if you look under wings, if you look under the middle cylinder, we have this emitters right here. So if I turn these on, you'll see that I have emitters at the end of this wing right here. And basically these are just two mesh items that I created and used snapping to place at the end of the wings here. We're going to use these emitters to emit the wing smoke trail. That'll just help us create some cool dynamic feel that as we exit or re-enter the atmosphere, there's some interaction between the wings and the atmosphere and wind and stuff around it. And the cool thing is these emitters are within this VG ship folder that we set up last week. So if we come over to animate, as our scene rocks back and forth, it should adjust the way that the smoke comes off of the tips of the wings here. So to set this up, I'm just going to do this in the Setup tab to begin with. And I'm going to go to Advanced OpenGL. I'm going to switch this to wireframe, and that should run a little bit smoother for us. So to set this up properly, there's a few things that I need. Obviously, I'm going to need my volume. So that gives us the volume here, and this is going to be what we just looked at, and we're going to dial this in. But I'm also going to come to particles here, and we can click on these. We can also come over to add item particles and click on them over here. But this is just a nice setup tab that Modo created for us. So we can click on Add Simulation. If we click on this, we'll add a particle simulation. I'm going to undo that actually though, because another thing that we can do is come over and click on Surface Emitter. And Surface Emitter will add Surface Emitter and particle simulation. And it does this because these are now connected. So if I were to drag one in here, we can see that we get the yellow diamond, and if I double click, we can see the surface emitter is now hooked up to our particle simulation. So let's start to look at these and see what these are doing. Our particle simulation item up here is actually going to be driving the particle simulation itself. If we click play now, nothing's going to happen because this particle simulation is hooked up to this surface emitter, so we need to set this up first. So if I come to source and select our emitters mesh item over here and then click play, we can see that we have some particles coming off of those emitters. And this is all live, and I can move around while this is generating. And we can see that it's kind of inheriting the velocity of where the plane is rocking. So obviously we're going to need to change a few things here. So under our surface emitter, this is where we're going to actually change the emission rate of how many particles are being generated. If I were to pull this way up, we can see there's a lot more particles coming off of this now. And if I were to pull this way down to, let's say, 50. So if this is hard to see, one of the things that we can do is actually come over to our particle simulation item, click on display, and change the size. So I'm just going to click 5. And now it changes the size of these particles. This is only happening within our viewport. This isn't actually changing the size of the particle itself. This is just purely for visualization purposes. Same thing, so if I stay in properties, you can see that this is linked to the display here. But I also can change the color, so maybe a nice bright red is going to be easier for us to see. And then maybe because of that, I just pull this down to 3. And there we have it. So this is all fine and dandy. But we want this to look like it's coming off the tips of the wings here. So let me just stop this simulation. Come back to surface emitter. And we have two things down here that might help us too. Inherent velocity is the reason why these particles were going up and down. If I were to uncheck this and play, you can see that even though the wings are moving back and forth, it's not flinging the particles out at all, because the particles basically with this checked on are going to calculate where this is moving and how fast it's moving and put that velocity into that particle. So if we want to see that, we're going to have to turn that back on. And the cool thing is this is all live. So from here, initial velocity, I'm going to turn this up, and we can start to see that this is spitting out our particles outward now. So let me just keep turning this up, and we can start to see what's happening here. And it's kind of giving us what we want. So I'm actually going to set this to maybe 150 meters a second. That's giving us a little bit better looking stream. Let me try 200. It's a little bit better too. So now I can come back to my emission rate, and let me just turn this up to something pretty high, like 500. And that's starting to look pretty good. Looks like a solid stream here. So let me click stop. and come back to the particle simulation and run you through what we can do here. So obviously we have things like gravity, called by age, which is going to cut off or make the particles disappear after a certain age. If we were to just activate this now and set this to 15 and play this again, we can see that the particles are getting cut off. So if we were to put this maybe around 80, and this actually might help us save some space and RAM, because these once we cache this out, these particles aren't going to be generated a ridiculous amount once they go. We don't need to render them when they're down here, obviously out of frame. But if we don't do this, it will save these particles all the way down in our scene. So I'm just gonna, let me see if I can get away with 60. Let me see if I can get away with 50. And I think that's good. I'm not going to push it too much from here. We could also turn on gravity if this was a different kind of particle simulation, but I think once we're going through our atmosphere, or if we're pretty high up in the clouds, we would want these just to kind of stay where they're at and not necessarily drop down or anything like that. Obviously we have acceleration for gravity. We can use drag, which if we start to turn this up, we can see the results of this. That's way heavy-handed, but let me just turn this down. You can start to see them slow down as they come out. So it's like it's battling against the wind force here, but obviously this isn't the result that we're after. Just wanted to show you what that looked like. And by the way, since this is its own separate channel, this is all animatable. So we could easily animate the drag here, get some really cool results. I'm just going to uncheck that because we don't necessarily need drag for right now. And just zero that out just in case. So I think that's good. I'm just going to cache my scene here. That way we can scrub through and see the results. So let me just select these nodes, move them out a little bit, drag my volume into the scene, and there's going to be a few other things that we need to set up to get this to work. So with my volume here selected, I'm going to hit 0 on the number pad, bring this full screen. We can see that I have particle geometry and particle source. So actually from my particle source, I want that to be my particle simulation. So now if we play this, we can see that our volume is hooked up to our particle simulation now automatically, and we have something happening here. So I'm going to cache this one more time, come over to my render tab just to update it, and we can see that we have something happening now. And actually I'm going to turn off the emitter's geometry, that way we don't get the little things right there. Collapse that back down. Click on our volume, and we can start to dial this in and do different things with it. So I'm going to just turn up my sphere radius quite big so we can start to see what's happening here. And we can see we get a bunch of these puffy little volumes coming out. So one of the things that we could do using our volume here is size gradient over age. I'm going to middle mouse click, double click on this new keyframe and set this to 20. So we can kind of see that over age now these particles get thinner and smaller. And actually that's not exactly what I want, so I'm just going to switch these. So it kind of gets bigger over age. And I'm going to select this one and set this to 75. So it doesn't get nearly as big over age here. And one thing I want to do is come back to my surface emitter and change the emission rate from 500 to, let's say, 900. And maybe 1200. Obviously, to see this, we need to recache this simulation. So I'm just going to come back to setup and recache this. And there you go. So if we come back to the render tab now, we can see that this is more of a solid string of particles here. And this will start to help visualize. We can actually go in and start to adjust how much noise is happening on these rocks here. So let me just dial this back down to maybe 3. And I'll change the offset to -1.5. And on this one, I'll change this down to... Actually, I'm going to do the same thing. And then recache the sim. And I think that's going to be a little bit better. A little bit less rockiness in the smoke trails here. And actually, I'm going to zoom in now and start to focus on this volume object. So it's the same thing we did before. I'm actually going to add a noise. Set that to volume density. And just group that. Call this volume. We want to be careful for this not to make this too cartoony. We can come down to shading and start to play with our hypertexture amount here. One of the things we might want to do is just bring down this noise scale here. And that's giving us a much better result. It actually might have been easier to set this up by just isolating everything else and looking at these volume as one piece, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with working this way. I actually kind of like it, and I'd eventually work this way if we were to dial this in a little bit more. Modo is extremely fast with its progressive rendering, so it's not that hard to come in and start to really dial in what we want. Modo's progressive renderer is pretty quick, so we can come in and dial in what we want on the fly here. So from here it's just manipulating our volume and our noise, which is drawing the volumetric density, and we can really dial in how we want this smoke to look here. So I'll leave that up to you guys because it's a very subjective thing, but you can start to see how absolutely quickly and awesomely Modo can set up this whole thing here. One other thing I might change is, obviously we're very high and this is starting to look a little bit darker than what we want. So I'm just going to come back to this volume item here and turn down the density even more. So we're going to get a lot more light coming through that. And I'm going to change the fall off to 100. Whoops, I meant 90. And that's going to give us a nice clean fall off edge here. That actually might be too much too. Let me try 75. And that's starting to get a more wispy look that you might see coming off the edge of a plane here. So it's just bob and weave back and forth, trying to find out what looks best for the scene and what looks, and to achieve the image that you're going for. So that's pretty much it for this class. In the next class, we'll render all of this out and we'll set it up, and then we'll hop into Nuke and start playing with some stuff to make this look pretty cool. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'd love to see your work in the forums, see what kind of volumetric stuff you come up with. If you guys really want to explore or experiment, you could easily try to make fire coming out of the exhaust here. If you decide to do that, the cool thing with this is these volumes are interactive with light. So if you were to put a red light back here, it would affect any kind of volumes that you have shooting out, which could give you a nice red hot glow or something like that. But anyway, that's it for this class. From here, it's basically just having fun and experimenting. So I hope you guys have fun over the week experimenting with this, and I'll see you in the next class. Alright, take care. Bye-bye.